Welcome to you all and to our online audience. I'm Orville Schell, and I direct the Center in U.S.-China Relations here at the Asia Society. And I'm very happy to welcome Li Shuo, who spent many years in China, advising Greenpeace on climate change, and is now here in Washington for the Asia Society at the Climate Hub. We have, I want to get your name right, Pan Suwanasang, right? I say it well?
Yes.
Good.
Correct.
Who is at Bentley College and specializes in sort of transnational rivers in Asia, and we're happy to have you here. And Farwa Amar, who's here at Asia Society at ASPE, running the Southeast Asia section. So I want to just mention before we have our participants speak with us that the reason why we're here is because we have an exhibit in the museum, which I hope you'll all see, called Coal Plus Ice, which is a visual representation through photography and video of the ice systems, the glaciers in the greater Himalayas that stretch all the way from Afghanistan, the Amur Darya River, all the way across the subcontinent, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, India, Burma, and the wraparound into China. And what happens in those mountains, affected by climate change, affects every single river. And you think about it, the Amur Darya, the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, Salween, Irrawaddy, Mekong, Yangtze River, and the Yellow River. So this is sort of, I like to describe it as the plumbing of Asia. And it's a system which no one paid a lot of attention to because we always thought that the Tibetan Plateau and these mountains were sort of, British used to describe them as the blank place on the map. But now we see they're of immense importance. And the downstream consequences of the rivers that flow out of these all have their headwaters up here. Every single one of those rivers does. Are what everybody in the Asian subcontinent, China, Southeast Asia depend on. And every civilization of consequence in history has grown up around a river system. So that's why we're here. So we hope you'll see the show, which will talk about the importance of this region and the consequences of climate change. And we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, why the river systems that come down out of there are of such immense importance to, I forget how many billion people it is, but China and India alone have 3 billion people. So it's a matter that we should pay some attention to. So why don't we start, and we're going to have each of our participants just sort of talk for, you know, 7, 8, 10 minutes. Then we'll chat a bit ourselves and then throw it open to questions to others. And so let's start with you, Farwa.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for turning up on a Thursday morning for this very important conversation. As Orville pointed out, you know, we're here to discuss the Himalayan region and the importance of the rivers. But if I may just start with a bit of a global picture. You know, climate change is unraveling on the planet much faster than anticipated. And you're seeing those changes with the shifts in your water patterns. Global water supplies, fresh water supplies are dwindling. And you are facing this massive challenge of water scarcity and water insecurity. There are about 2 billion people who are impacted by this. 2.3 billion people live in countries that are considered to be water stressed, which means they do not have the water supplies to meet immediate population demands. And about 733 million people live in countries that are highly or critically water stressed. And this situation or the scenario is only going to exacerbate as climate change intensifies. And we are talking about a region here, particularly I focus on South Asia. South Asia is a dynamic region, 1.9 billion population and growing. And it's also very high on the climate vulnerability risk. Since we're talking about water and climate here, South Asia is a prime example and case study when it comes to how these two things coupled together is a double-edged sword in many ways. You have the challenge of water scarcity and water insecurity, which only becomes acute when you view it from the vantage of transboundary river basins, which means that your river is being shared by two or more countries who don't necessarily often cooperate on the joint management of the rivers. And as this water supply becomes more and more scarce, you will see a scenario where individual countries might want to protect these resources for their own populations, which can lead to competition and potential conflict between riparian countries and upstream countries and downstream countries. For South Asia, it's a persistent challenge. We have some of the most dynamic countries in the world who are economically developing. There is India, there's Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and of course, at the top of it, China has the headwaters to all the rivers that flow through this region. South Asia has some of the most important transboundary river basins. You mentioned some of them. Yarlung Tsangpo Brahmaputra, which is shared between India, China, Bhutan, and Bangladesh. There's the Indus River Basin, predominantly shared by India and Pakistan, but also China and Afghanistan. You have the Ganges River Basin with India and Bangladesh predominantly. And what do we know of these countries if you bring the geopolitics is that they don't necessarily have a very cordial relationship with one another. They have deep history of mistrust and sort of adversarial in many ways. So if you are to pick one of those examples and elaborate on how the geopolitics angle comes into the whole idea of climate change impacting water supplies and these rivers, the Yarlung Tsangpo Brahmaputra is one of the most important examples. It is one of the youngest rivers in Asia. It's extremely important to sustain lives and livelihoods both in China, India, and all the way up to Bangladesh. And it's very close to the disputed border between China and India, which is, of course, the line of action control. We can go more into the nuances of why this is a contentious issue and why it has been a contentious issue for many years. But it's not just limited to that within South Asia. You also have India and Pakistan sharing the Indus River Basin, and also a disputed border in between, which is the line of control. And then there you have a treaty in place, but one with caveats. So South Asia is one of those regions where, of course, I can go on and on about it, but I want to save some of it for the discussion that we'll have amongst us and with you guys, it's a prime example of how non-cooperation or lack of cooperation could potentially impact how these freshwater resources will not be able to sustain the populations that the region is growing with, and how the demands, whether agrarian, development, industrial, are going to get compromised if not taken the right action or not given importance in terms of the policy discourse. Hydrodiplomacy, regional cooperation, the importance of mechanisms which are not in place, or if they are, what are the challenges that exist? These are some of the areas that we should definitely focus on in our conversation today. But I'll stop here, and I guess I'll move it on to Pon.
Pon, maybe before you start, let's just take the Mekong as an example of the kind of challenges we confront, because it rises in China, flows down between Laos and Thailand, and Cambodia and Vietnam are really dependent on it, particularly the Delta region in Vietnam. And just a sentence or two about why it matters what happens in the Himalayas. As the glaciers melt, there's a very delicate balance between the monsoons that fill the rivers when the monsoons come across India and the subcontinent. But it is in the swing season, when the monsoons stop and it's dry, that the glaciers start melting and kick in to keep the flows of all of these rivers we've been talking about constant. Now, if you have a river that only flows certain times of year, you can't have a city. You can't have it's a non-functioning operation. So just wanted to just give you those little bits of dynamics before we maybe hear it from you, Pon, about the Mekong.
I guess I'll try to mix the personal and the professional. looked at my grandmother passed, and I saw a black and white photo of her in the 60s on the Mekong and along the Mekong, sort of doing what you would call like a Buddhist sort of offering ritual. And the river was plentiful, and over the last 16 years, I've been doing research about the Mekong countries. I started out looking at hydropower and energy, and then moved into looking also at the Salween and the Irrawaddy in Myanmar. And I think for the scientific community, people who work in the natural sciences, social sciences, people who are just concerned about these extreme weather patterns and the ways that they affect the ecology of river communities, human communities, animal communities, fishing communities, aquaculture, the entire natural ecosystems that these river systems sustain. Everybody sort of talks about climate as a buzzword, but when it comes to sort of engaging with the evidence of trying to find technical and multilateral solutions, we seem to, the numbers aren't really measuring up. The money that the Mekong River Commission spends on climate adaptation is a drop in the bucket compared to what it spends on many other sort of geopolitical concerns. And so the Himalayas, I think I'm sitting next to the expert who can talk to us about, I think, the hydrology and other sort of atmospheric components of the Himalayas. I would say, as when I started studying the Mekong and the Salween, the intellectual, theoretical impact of people who had studied the Himalayas all through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s it drives how people conceptualize and talk about the Mekong today. This whole upstream, downstream, particularly after the Trump administration, this kind of US-China rivalry of China is withholding water through reservoir politics to downstream countries, and this sort of, continuing narrative. It's a recycled narrative from the Himalayan environmental degradation thesis of the 60s and 50s, or 60s and 70s, which is, India is doing this to China, and you see these sort of geopolitical narratives being recycled over and over when it's convenient for different parties to do so. So I guess my concern is how do we sort of talk about the Mekong and the Salween in its own right, and also how do we sort of move the dial on these somewhat fossilized concepts that have sort of, I think, in some ways kept Himalayan multilateral discourses in static motion, and I think sort of tend to calcify Mekong relations as well, right?
Well, wouldn't you say the most sort of difficult knot to untie is the simple fact that all of these rivers rise in Chinese territory, and basically China says, this is ours, and we'll do what we want upstream, and the devil take the hindmost downstream, and if you don't like it, let's have a little commission and waste a lot of time and not do anything about it.
I'm really the last person to be a China apologist. However, if you
it'd be
follow,
great to try.
But if you follow, if you follow every day sort of, the very mundane bureaucratic processes of different delegations of people and junkets moving from country to country, who goes to the MRC meetings, who goes to the Lansang Mekong cooperation meetings, who goes to the U.S. Mekong dialogue, there is actually a lot of sort of footwork to try to get dialogue and data sharing. Some people think it's posturing, but there's actually a lot of legwork and human resources put in, like who actually gets put on a plane to attend a meeting to talk about, hammer out these issues, and they're doing it. I think it's politically convenient for some actors on both sides in China and the U.S. to perpetuate this kind of polarized, recalcitrant, sort of upstream, downstream. I think it's also convenient for the U.S. to pin Cambodia and Vietnam against the other Mekong countries to I think the collective Mekong's detriment, right? So I think the overall point that I'm really concerned about over the last 16 years of professional engagement in this region and physically seeing the river dry up, right? So that, there are fishing communities that have yet to figure out what their next steps are, right? There are now precarious communities that are migrant laborers moving into organized crime, human trafficking, the sort of phone scams that you probably get, are these people sort of being moved into weird crypto casino operations. All of these things are very interlinked. And so I think the overall thing is, how do we get to actual climate adaptation in a both bureaucratic and technical sense, and sort of using more of that community grassroots and scientific sort of evidence-based approach to challenge some of these wider continual geopolitical bogeymen that really it's dispiriting to see that the same sort of discourses continue to repeat themselves every decade. I read historical stuff from the 60s and 70s, and they're alive, very alive and well within certain quarters of Washington, D.C., Beijing, and elsewhere.
So how would you say we're doing? We've been talking for decades. What results give you real cause for hope?
I think that I think two things. I think there's a generational change happening in the Mekong now. In terms of leadership, a lot of people are, the old guard, people who are in their 40s, late 30s, 40s, and 50s, who are sort of really committed to their careers, but also moving the dial on this. And the second part just slipped my mind. But,
well, we can come back to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is a critical question for us to come to some assessment of what's been done and is there hope going forward. So let's maybe move on to you, Li Shuo. Obviously, China is upstream. Everybody else is downstream. And that makes a huge difference. I mean, China wants to build a dam. What does Cambodia, of course, Cambodia and China are quite friendly, but what would Thailand, Laos, Vietnam get to say about it? And the same with all of the rivers that flow down into India, where you all surely know that there's a fair amount of contention, not only in Ladakh. China's been nibbling away at big pieces of Bhutan. There's a huge piece in northeast of India, Arunachal Pradesh, which China claims, and at some point is going to do something about. So how do you view the prospects of China's willingness to solve some of the problems that Pan has been talking about in rivers like the Mekong, but every other river for that matter too?
Sure. Although I won't pretend that I have the silver bullet here, but maybe just to build on from what Pan just said. I also have a similar sentiment that when I look at water politics in this part of the world, either China with South Asian countries or Southeast Asian countries, I feel like a lot of the narratives are very familiar. They have been there for a long time. And those narratives are not guiding those countries to actually
describe some of the narratives, like
just the typical upstream, downstream. This dynamic, right? That the upstream country certainly has the monopoly of the resource, and then the downstream countries are left in this quite helpless situation. There is a fundamental lack of political will, and this is, all the countries are following a very transactional zero-sum mindset. I do think to some extent those narratives, are true, right? But I think it is even more important to actually find new ways to help those countries to move beyond, certain framings. And I think, look, we have a new challenge, right, which is also what we're discussing today, in addition to water politics. If you think water is difficult, complex, cross-boundary, we have climate change now, right, which we have a whole exhibition on just downstairs. And you will realize that this is even more of a challenging issue. This is the mother of all the crises, if you will. And this will have much more profound impact. and not just this part of the world, but also across the globe. So the question that I had while I was listening to you, Peng, is are we going to be guided by some of the similar narratives that these countries have been faced with when they deal with their water issues, when they look at this new challenge, climate change, when they actually need real, urgent, and even more sophisticated solutions, right? Can they work together? It is actually in their interest. If you think water might be a more zero-sum game, if you have more water resource, in upstream countries, then downstream countries will be deprived of that resource. Climate change actually offers, an opportunity for them to work together, because at the end of the day, if they can reduce emissions, they can better coordinate to react to some of the impacts of climate change, they will all be better off. So I think the critical and the timely question is, again, moving beyond the old narratives on water to confront the new and even more challenging crisis that we're facing.
And have we moved beyond the old narratives?
I have thoughts on that. It's somebody who's been studying this very closely, especially from a water diplomacy perspective, precisely trying to change the narrative here through whatever small role that one could play in this larger scheme of things. It's hard on water. It's because as much as we can sit down and say water must not be politicized and must not be securitized, it is in the interest of these countries and the interest of their populations that water is seen as a shared resource, and the crisis in terms of water stress and water scarcity is considered to be a shared challenge that needs cooperative action. But there's something that you mentioned, which is China sits at the headwaters of these rivers, and it has this control of, okay, we're going to divert the waters when we want. But there's a bit of what Peng had mentioned and brings the climate angle in. The hydrology is very important to understand. The one way to change the narrative is to make this entire conversation inclusive and representative and holistic. It must not be done in silos. You need to bring in the science. You need to bring in the engineering. You need to bring in the civil society and the local communities, for really all stakeholders should come together to make a conscious decision. Because in the absence of it, it's only seen through a political lens. South Asia, precisely, has a history of, and still continues to be, one of reactionary policy making. Issues are seen either bilateral or considered, solutions are only issue-based. They're not made with foresight. The Yarlung Tsangpo Brahmaputra, since you talked about the contention around Arunachal Pradesh, it's very important to understand how does that basin work with the threat perception of it. So when you look at the basin flowing, yes, it originates in the Tibet Autonomous Region, it flows, it takes a bend, which is known in the Grand Canyon in the Medoc County, and falls from a staggering height, which has large energy producing capabilities, and then flows downstream to India and then on to Bangladesh. So in 2020, as a part of the 14th five-year plan of China, which is, of course, focused on social and economic development, China had released this aim and ambition of building a super dam. I mean, that's the term that we started popularly using it, but that will be at the Great Bend. That curvature is the first time that China had released a plan to build a dam on the mid-reaches, or the lower reaches, rather, of the Brahmaputra. Before that, things have happened in the past. Of course, there is an exchange-level mechanism set between India and China over the Brahmaputra. They have an MOU, which we can talk more about, how for sharing data across 3 hydrological stations on the Brahmaputra in order to preempt any flooding episodes down in India. India was monitoring it, but not necessarily raising any red flags about it, because it was all in the upstream that China dam building process was going on. Now, here in the lower reaches, it's about 30 kilometers from the line of action control. It's very close to Arunachal Pradesh, which could be seen as a strategic move by China, especially because of the timing. In India, there were like alarm bells because there was the two were at loggerheads on the border, following, of course, what happened in the Galwan Valley, and then you had this being released right after. So were the two supposed to be linked together from a China perspective was the question. Is it supposed to be a strategic move to have leverage over Delhi? Is that what Beijing is trying to do? But if you try and understand how that dam might impact or divert the flow of the river from India from a scientific perspective, then understanding that hydrology and bringing the science is very important. And that's where you realize that the Yarlung Tsangpo Brahmaputra, yes, China has the largest basin area for the river, but much of it falls in the rain shadow area of it. And Brahmaputra is a river that's precipitation fed, which means that rainfall plumps up its volume. So really, any sort of dam building that was happening in the upstream on the mid reaches would not let China really hold on to that water, because the water really plumps up when it enters downstream. India, Bangladesh, those areas are high on the precipitation cycle. So your hydrology actually makes you understand that what is the threat perception and what's the reality and capability. What, however, the threat really lies with these infrastructure building is, could China, as it claims it's a run-of-the-river sort of a project, they're not storing it, but it's in a seismic zone. That's a concern. That's where you should be coming together with your riparian country, that this dam building activity is happening in a seismic zone, which is not in the interest of your communities living across the basin, not our communities living around the basin. What is the ecological disruption and the ecological health of the river going to be? What is going to be the silt situation? Is there going to be sediment trapping happening, which could impact downstream countries? And then more so, you talk about the timing of the flow. Could China potentially use it as a strategic measure? Yes, it could, but not by simply diverting waters, which is the larger threat perception, but more in terms of it can alter the timing of the flow of the release, which can cause artificial flooding downstream. And more than India, it impacts Bangladesh. So I think that's one case study, and this is happening all in the absence of a bilateral legal agreement for these upstream and downstream countries to come together. If that would have been in place, had there been a river basin organization along the lines of, say, the Mekong River Commission within South Asia, one could hope, you would have some system of communication, which is not necessarily there.
Even that is not very successful.
And it's not very successful where it exists.
We're talking, listen, I want to get back to you, Li Shuo, because I want to ask you, since China is so seminal in this, what do you think the chances are of them saying, yes, we do want to share this resource? It's essential. We actually do want an effective system, not just talk. Not another Mekong River Commission, but something where India could have confidence that its rivers are a shared resource with China. Do you think that's possible?
Oh, well, I mean, I wouldn't underestimate the political challenges to get there. Look,
Well, estimate the possibilities then.
Well, I think, if we're talking about China and India, the relationship is at a rock bottom, right? So I think what you need is probably a reinvigoration of the broader relationship first before you get to some of the very thorny water challenges. So I think the political reality that we have to deal with in the near term is indeed there will be a lot of deadlocks, in particular in that side of the region. Wondering, I mean, Peng, if we can kind of draw inspiration from the Mekong part of it, even though I recognize that's also pretty challenging. But look, I think. Going back to your question, how do we find solutions? I still think we need to find a different way of approaching all these issues, right? To try to find ways to depoliticize this issue, to demonstrate that working together is actually in all the countries' interests, and really kind of move the narrative beyond the ones that we have been using for the last half a century.
Do you think that's possible?
Well, I think it will be very hard. I think that's what we're discussing here, right? I'm trying to find collective solutions and drawing inspiration and thoughts from all the experts. But I would say I wouldn't underestimate the difficulties. It is indeed a challenging issue. As Phyllis said, when it comes to water, you have this intrinsic physical constraint, right? Which is you have the upstream downstream dynamic.
Yeah.
Some countries will come in, first before the others. So how do you move beyond that intrinsic?
Well, there's really only one country that matters here. Let's be frank. So let me ask you, Pan. I mean, you're concerned yourself with the Mekong. Mekong's headwaters are in China. Everybody else is dependent on what happens downstream. There are other factors that enter, of course. How do you think the countries that in Southeast Asia view the prospects of some kind of meaningful sharing agreement arriving with China? I mean, they're building dams. It's pretty astounding the number of dams that have been put on the Mekong in China. Which of course,
China is the construction China for a while through the 90s and 2000s, the U.S. and mostly Thai commercial banks financed hydropower. In fact, the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank implemented sort of a master policy to turn Laos, which controls much of the Mekong Basin water resources, into the battery of Asia. So this was really a World Bank, Asian Development Bank, all through huge multi-billion-dollar slush fund through the 90s and 2000s, which gave Laos this hubris to say, with this country of 7 million people can somehow build, over $40 billion worth of dam hydropower construction when, the world's superpower in the U.S. cannot even retrofit 10 dams a year, right? So the money and the capabilities were sort of implemented by greater powers. Today, I think that grand plan has now shifted into, Chinese business dealings in terms of getting these contracts. I think this point, on the one hand, of course, I agree with you. I want to sort of have this depoliticized focus on, climate, water, energy, food-based sort of approaches as a scientist myself. But as a scientist who has been observing how government officials and bureaucrats actually operate, right? Ministries, who goes to meetings, what do they talk about in the region? It really demystified some things for me. And I think they should get more political and to be more innovative and interesting about it. And one example for that I'll talk about in the Mekong, this whole upstream, downstream China's bogeyman framing, right? It usually concerns Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Like Vietnam sees itself as we're disengaged, we're looking towards Japan and South Korea and the South China Sea, and we care about other stuff, even though the US says, oh, Vietnam is the most impacted. And I think that there's actually should be some more interesting, creative politicking, horse trading, saying, if you want action on the South China Sea, Vietnam as our ally, the US, for example, right, or other Mekong countries, you need to take more leadership in Mekong transboundary issues. You can't just let these other drivers, these other countries lead the way. So your question was, what are the Mekong countries doing about Big Bag China? If they were so worried about Big Bag China, why would they each individually and collectively keep creating new mechanisms with China? It's not, I don't think it's only sort of economic and diplomatic sort of relationships. Your previous question, I think to go back to it, can we get beyond these old sort of anachronistic narratives? And I think China honestly does a better job at least paying some acknowledgement to individual Mekong countries and what they're trying to say. And in sort of US speak, Mekong countries feel that they're being heard, right? So I think the thing that sort of I had a brain fart about was we have a generational change happening in the Mekong, but we also have a fiscal change. So when you talk about the Mekong River Commission, OECD countries, donor countries are spending less and less and less for all kinds of reasons, like normative human rights concerns, environmental concerns. And so Mekong countries themselves, Mekong taxpayers, are footing more of the bill for all of these transboundary issues, sending people to meetings, figuring out what to do. And the more that they have to pay and continue to keep paying, the more they're going to want to sort of have their narratives really heard at the MRC. And I think this kind of US Cold War relic of the US kind of framing these big discourses is going to sort of, is doing the US a disservice as an ally in that region. And I think that's where sort of China does better at doing the sort of one-to-one and collective diplomacy of, we hear you, your voice is valid, your narratives are valid, you're living this reality, and we're your neighbor and we completely agree, right? And this sort of playing countries off each other is, I think, not only sort of divisive, but also geopolitically counterproductive to the US's end goal.
So let's look at India and Pakistan from that reference. I mean, you can't say that they're exactly in the US orbit completely. How would you say their sort of negotiations over their river systems are going?
So with India and Pakistan, there actually comes a good example, a best practice for the Indus Waters Treaty in the region. It's been obviously arbitrated by the World Bank since 1960, stood the test of wars, stood the test of time. And Pakistan and India don't necessarily have very good relations, and they've only become further tense in the past couple of years. But the Indus Waters Treaty allows for a dialogue, more goodwill-based, but allows for a dialogue between these two countries. They have a permanent Indus Commission, and the commissioner stated for individual countries, for both India and Pakistan, who come together and they have dialogue over what is infrastructure development looking like on the Indus River Basin. They have their own challenges. That the treaty comes with caveats, and in many ways, when you're looking at the treaty today, you would realize that it's not meant for contemporary challenges. It has to be updated, ideally in a world where India and Pakistan, along with the rest of the region, could come together. We could look at an Indus Treaty 2.0, which caters to the massive population growth, to the impacts of climate change. But unfortunately, that stage has not gotten. We have not gotten to the stage yet, and there's always a challenge right now, particularly the two dam designs between what India has proposed. Pakistan objects to it because it believes that India might be able to divert waters. India believes that it's well within the rights of the Indus Waters Treaty. They're allowed non-consumptive rights to the western rivers, which by virtue of the treaty were allocated to the Pakistan, and India received the eastern rivers. So, but it's an ongoing dialogue. But beyond India and Pakistan, if you look at the rest of the region, there's also this Joint River Commission. There's also the Ganges Waters Treaty, which was, it's a 30-year treaty, which is up for revision in 2026 between India and Bangladesh. Another example of something that was signed by the two countries to work together on this river of great importance, yet has many challenges, particularly from the downstream side of things. Bangladesh has not been able to claim exactly what were the clauses and the rights within the legal agreement. And there are other such examples between India and China. Also, the expert level mechanism is a way of a dialogue which goes on by means of no legally binding agreement. But there are examples, Orwell, where the region, the Himalayan region, can actually learn from, elsewhere in the world when you look at the transboundary river basins. And that has an upstream, downstream narrative also, which is the Senegal River Basin Development Organization. In West Africa, the four countries have come together, and they've been working since 1972 together collectively on how this river is going to be equitably used between all countries, what the joint infrastructure development will look like. The Nile Basin Initiative, again, another challenge where you have an upstream and downstream situation and dynamic. You have 10 countries working together. So if you could have this challenge persist in other parts of the world, which are not too far from where the Himalayan region lies, you could use that as an example and elevate that and bring it to the policy discourse and show real political will. But now, because things are so economically charged in the world today, there's a real commercial value also to come together. And I think if the private sector starts playing a role along with the public sector, and of course the civil society, there's potential to allow for cooperation to happen.
Well, indeed, there is potential. There's always potential. There's always impediments as well. So let me throw a question to all three of you before we maybe open it to the audience. All of the things you've been talking about are caught within a political field of gravity. And it is that field of gravity which makes these other very practical mechanisms, which you could, Senegal, Nile, whatever. Yes, human beings know what to do. That's not the difficult part. The difficult part is transcending the political challenges that divide countries. Do you all think that we are getting closer or farther away in terms of ameliorating the political problems which prevent us from having some sort of multilateral solutions to these problems? Let's start with you, Li-Shuo.
Yeah, no, I think that's a tough question. But let me just kind of throw one more complexity in here. We haven't talked about coal, which is the other part of our exhibition downstairs, and I think coal is relevant because it is actually indeed in the pursuit of some of those countries' effort to diversify their energy consumption, right? That they come to hydropower and dams. And therefore, you have a lot of the ecological and political problems associated with dam building. So in a way, there is a connection actually between coal and hydro, right? And we should also not forget that in the regions that we're talking about, South Asia, Southeast Asia, China, of course, we were seeing some of the biggest coal consumers in the world. And coal, of course, is the dirtiest fossil fuel.
China and India are two.
The number one and number two coal consumers in the world, right? And that is accelerating climate change and then adding more pressure and stress to this region when it comes to water. So I just want to kind of point that out. But going back to your question, look, I think the politics will be very difficult, as I mentioned, given the bilateral relationship between some of the countries in the region. But at the same time, I feel like there's actually one thing that actually ties all these countries together in a much stronger way than between them and some of the developed countries. And that thing is this shared desire for development, economic, social, human development. Right? All the countries in this region faces the same challenge. They need to bring people out of poverty. They need to do that fast, and in light of the ecological challenges. So how do they do that? I think maybe there is a way. I mean, if we're talking about forward-looking, trying to find solution, maybe there is a way to leverage that desire, right? The desire to develop. And in a lot of cases, economic development requires cooperation and coordination between countries in this region.
But in fact, we see exactly the opposite happening now, decoupling.
Right. So that's, so the development agenda is also been challenged. But I think it just requires all these countries to look at their core interest even harder, to be focused on their development agenda and see what is in their real interest to achieve that. And maybe if they can do that, they will then realize when it comes to some of the shared resources in this part of the world, they actually need to get their act together and to work together. Maybe there is a way there that could help us move beyond the very static, geopolitics.
Phan?
So I'll give an example from my recent field work the last 2 years. I think outside of many countries in the Mekong, there's this sort of wider Western global discourse around greening, and for a lot of Mekong countries, their immediate pressing concerns for Laos, for example, is riding through the economic crisis of COVID and the Ukraine war pushing up fuel prices. So last summer, I tried to get to the airport in a tuk-tuk and we stopped by two fuel stations, neither of them would sell us gas or for the tuk-tuk.
Where is this?
In Laos, in Vientiane, in the capital. This past summer, I was there. There were the whole city is full of Tesla knockoff, build your dream China electric vehicles, and that's not because Laos suddenly over the course of the year, the Lao government was like, oh, we should switch to EV vehicles. It was because they could not afford to import fuel. And so I think these types of crises, economic crises, ecological crises, climate crises, is going to sort of, force them to confront a lot of these issues.
When you say them, it may force the
These
Laotians.
governments, I think it's going to.
What does China care about?
China cares because it's, it wants to export stuff. Other countries care because to the extent that the mainland Mekong countries like to jockey. Laos has this explosion, right? Like, you wouldn't expect it to sort of be the leapfrogging EV country of the mainland, but it is now out of fiscal crises because it built all these hydropower dams that it now can't pay the sort of principal on, right? So so now it has to import EVs, and then Vietnam's looking at this, Cambodia's looking at this. They're all thinking
that's not bad, is it?
Yeah, no, it's great. It's like crises is sort of breeding. It's kicking all of them in the pants to do things, and then now they're sort of we got to figure out.
But you're dodging my question of politics.
I think the politics is always going to be there, but I think that the realities that sort of are going to force business and technological solutions, that is going to sort of have to force them into new paradigms, new ways of talking about this, and to more rapidly absorb and transform these, sort of move past some of these limiting discourses. It's just going to have, when people can't get to work and they can't buy fuel, you'd be surprised at how, what is it, the acronym about Laos is people don't rush. You'd be surprised how quickly the Ministry of Transport and Ministry of Finance can get something out when, there are gas lines and people get really pissed off. It's fascinating how quickly things can happen.
So, from perspective of South Asia, what do you think? I mean, are we going to transcend these political challenges to be able to get something done, or doesn't it matter?
Well, when talking about politics in South Asia, I'll say what I'll say about the South Asia elections. It's all going to be more of the same. But it'll be unjustified to say the needle has not moved. It has. This conversation that we're having in the room today is part of that evidence. We have seen water security, the need for water diplomacy, if not water diplomacy itself, elevate into the policy discourse in the region. Not at the level we would want it to be, not necessarily at all, but it has improved in many ways. There's a reason that now there's so much intellectual expertise coming out of the region focused on not only just water, but when they look at the water, food, energy nexus, when they look at climate change, they really hone in on that point. Political will, regional cooperation, political will, regional cooperation, time and again. You have all of these wonderful, grandiose summits that happen every single year. We had the UN Water Conference last year, big show. COP had started dedicating a day to water. We have the One Water Summit coming up, the World Water Forum coming up. So all of these are opportunities for not only these regional countries to come together, but in a way come together with the international community to, if they really would want to come up with solutions that can help secure the future of these rivers that are so deeply intertwined with the politics of the region. And within that, I think one important aspect is that if the international community's role is to be amplified or it could do something, is to make sure that these countries can really understand and maybe sign up and ratify to the international conventions that are present on the non-navigational use of water, transboundary water resources, or in order to make sure they're preventing anything that's unilateral. But also, in many ways, for the region in itself, rejuvenating regional cooperation. I won't say SARC because it's rather zombie of an organization, but but you take BIMSTEC or you take BBIN, you take other platforms where the regional countries are coming together to use them as a platform to discuss climate adaptation, to discuss water diplomacy, water cooperation. So, our role is to push for that, advocate for that in whatever capacity, and but without political will, it has been hard, but it has improved from what, say, it was in the last decade.
I mean, we've had many, many COP conferences, and I would have to say the temperature is still rising.
Yes, and the water is still evaporating.
Yes.
And the glacier is still melting.
And the glaciers are still melting.
Which again is something that if you look from China's own in-house perspective, it's a water scarce country. It's a heavily water scarce country. And whatever, just for one of their rivers, the Brahmaputra, their share is mostly glacial melt. And with rising temperatures, this means that with years to come, they will become excessively more water scarce. So they have their own internal challenges to deal with, but they have a lot of economic interests in South Asia. And so how could you leverage the economics of it and bring the climate and water? That's been something that the region has not been able to do, or at least figure it out just as yet.
Well, I admire all of your relative optimism as an antidote to my relative gloom. But with that, let's throw it open to you all. Yes, a question. We have a microphone for online.
Thank you. You mentioned at the beginning that there were 3 billion people between India and China. My question to the panel is there any political policy in place connecting overpopulation with climate change? Do they have an awareness of this? I know China had a limited child policy for years, but the simple truth is there are too many humans on the planet, and we need to be heated and get around, and our modernity is melting our planet.
Paradoxically, though, China now has got a concern about too few people. So we may have reached a tipping point there, but what do you all think?
I'm not a China-India expert, but I do think that this discourse, this kind of Malthusian discourse around population size and demography, specifically, tends to sort of point its gaze at developing countries, sidesteps. If we had the infographic up, right, you'd see that, the big corner of climate change sort of emissions and consumption is, the U.S., right? The U.S. is like 3 times more. I don't know, you would know the figures better. Yeah. More than 3 times more, right? We were only 300 million people in the U.S., and we're gobbling up resources and emitting stuff, driving huge, gas-guzzling vehicles, vis-a-vis, 3 billion people in this really sort of constrained space across the world. So policies, resource sharing policies and population and consumption policies for whom, right? Where is the U.S. going to sort of start banning, large off-road vehicles that take up tons of gas or that emit, or I don't know, constrain private industries that produce concrete, or go to Texas and regulate, LNG. Gas and other sort of, population matters, but there are so many other mitigating channels to address climate change that need not point at some of the most poor and vulnerable in the world, right?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, I think population size is probably only one of the many indicators when you look at climate action and climate solution. And indeed, although you said, I mean, the irony now is China has already peaked its population growth, and the problem seems to be the population is now growing fast enough. Therefore, you have a lot of other socioeconomic problems associated with it. The aging population and so on. I think an interesting kind of forward-looking question is. now that, well, if we have to talk about population and its relationship with climate action, now that the Chinese population has already peaked, what does that mean to the to the country's emission profile? So China's carbon emission is still growing, right? But a lot of analysts are projecting that we're getting closer to a peak point.
And they're also doing a tremendous amount in renewable energy in
Right.
China, even though carbon emissions are rising at the same time.
That's right. So that's sort of, there's a lot of irony in the China climate story. But I think the bottom line here, as a forward-looking question is, following the population peak, are we going to see emission peak also very soon? There is also this is a bit technical, but a pretty interesting connection there between population and emission growth, which is, if you look at what has been driving China's emissions over the last 2 decades or so, a lot of the emissions come from infrastructure development, the housing and real estate sector. You need a lot of cement and steel, right, to build basically big buildings. That's about a third of China's emission over the last two decades. So now that you're now having, a robust population growth anymore, you don't need that much infrastructure.
And you're having a
housing.
property crisis.
Yes, and there is a poverty crisis. There is actually an oversupply of basically residential buildings and houses. Would that actually help the country to plateau and even decline its emissions within this decade? Just from my area of work, these are the questions that people are looking at, which has some relation with population.
Well, there's nothing like a good recession to cut carbon emissions.
Right.
So any other question? Yes, right here.
Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Good morning. I'm Ritika. I am a graduate student at American University in DC. My question was regarding Bangladesh. So when we look at Bangladesh and India, there has been a treaty, and there also has been cooperation, sort of. There were recently an MOU regarding water between both the countries, but there also has been a constant discontent in Bangladesh regarding India not understanding, let's say, the vulnerabilities Bangladesh has regarding the Brahmaputra River. Bangladesh is like, it had probably 70% dependent on the fresh water that comes out of Brahmaputra. So my question is that what has been the, I won't say solution, but what has been the progress in terms of the discontent we see, or just the dynamics between the water sharing and the water management between India and Bangladesh? And if we have to put it, let's say, in a prospective scenario between India and China, to what extent can we say that this situation of one country not, let's say, understanding the vulnerabilities of the other country or not taking it that seriously would be impacting any future cooperation mechanism or, any dialogue between two countries or more?
So water dynamics between India, maybe you, Farwa.
Yeah,
and Bangladesh.
Thank you, Ritika. Unfortunately, the region that we're talking about, water is extremely territorial. And that discontent and not realizing the vulnerabilities that might lie with the depleting flows to one country over the other is something that, unfortunately, countries are not that perceptive to. They're thinking very unilaterally. They're thinking for, very self-interest-based approach. And that's in many ways, sort of the name of the game in the region. It's a bureaucratic way of looking at things. Everything happens in silos. So even within the country or within the state, one sector doesn't necessarily understand the vulnerabilities of the other sectors, leave alone cross-border. In India and Bangladesh's case, these two also have their own history of mistrust over the Ganges and the Teesta. The Farakka Barrage has been a point of contention forever, even though the Ganges Water Treaty is there, right? We talked about it earlier. And 1996 was when formalized up in 2026 for revision. That treaty still has concerns from Bangladesh. There have been concerns from many analysts and experts sitting in Bangladesh that was not even based on accurate flow data. And because of that, did we get the right were we on the winning side at all? Was it a win-win outcome at all? The Teesta River Treaty was something that during the times of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in India was supposed to be signed, but then never saw the light of the day. So that treaty never actually came into being also. So these two countries, again, have not found momentum in terms of a solid cooperation over the rivers. But because of the different aspects that connect these countries beyond their water element, which is their economic relationship, which is their energy trade now. I think a lot of these water-related, climate-related things, they're not prioritized enough because the energy and the economy takes precedent. And you want to be able to target those in that equation first. And you see that similar dynamic play out elsewhere. Bangladesh is going to lose out the most if there was ecological disruption of the Brahmaputra River, because as the sediment trapping happens, Bangladesh, the health of the Brahmaputra, and when it becomes Jamuna in India, in Bangladesh, pardon me, will be not much of the use to the agricultural sector or for consumption purposes. So, but Bangladesh also has massive investments from China. So what stance would the government take in a formal manner when it comes in front of China across the table and say, do we talk water first, or we talk about all your BRI investments, or your energy investments? So it's a bit of like, what sense, again, we can't remove politics from it, unfortunately. So that big question, do you see it as a priority as the population does? And we haven't, and to your point on population, by the way, we haven't even discussed climate-induced migration or water-induced migration, which is going to add to this population. So policy is not only for now, what we see, but also the bloat that we'll see in the coming years.
Which we see in Europe, across the Mediterranean. Maybe one more question, and then I think we'll stop. Yes, gentleman in the back.
Hi, thanks everyone for speaking. So I have a question about the intra-political conflicts within the countries of the Mekong Delta. And just to analogize it a bit, so here in the United States, in the Western states in particular, we have the prior appropriation doctrine, basically a first in time, first in right, property rights doctrine over water use. I'm curious what legal doctrines exist in the Mekong Delta countries for water allocation and use, and the political conflicts that these might beget.
There are overlapping. There aren't sort of straightforward. Customary use rights used to be sort of respected on a case-by-case area basis. I think one point that I sort of thought about as I was listening to my co-panelists, I think this perspective around legality, international law applied to that region is perhaps, it's not insignificant, but I think it's a lens that is not perhaps the most useful, because use rights, the sort of codified legal approach to it, I think is not how it actually sort of gets arbitrated, even between provinces, let alone between governments. So sorry to sort of poo-poo your question on that one. Perhaps we can have one more question.
All right, let's have it from the woman in the blue sweater.
We've been talking about scarcity and governments regulating water flow, et cetera. I wondered what the quality of this water is. Is pollution an issue, especially the more downstream you've got, more potential of things contaminating water? So I wondered how that falls into it.
Any thoughts? I mean, of course, the water is fairly clean when it comes off the Tibetan Plateau. And as it flows down through maybe several countries, it does get silt, pollution, one thing and another. So it's sort of a more of a downstream problem than an upstream problem.
Even the downstream countries themselves, it's like the gentleman who was talking about sort of, codified rights and things like that, right? There are some of the greenest environmental laws around water usage and water pollution that are supposed to be sort of implemented within Mekong countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. first developed, by the World Bank and now sort of implemented much more so. But they're not enforced. And so an example of this is there is a rapidly growing, it used to be that, rubber and banana plantations, like if you look at Laos, would be in the upper regions, kind of marginal rural areas. But now land values, even in semi-urban or around the capital, particularly during the economic crisis, have made it very profitable for urban elites to lease land to foreign investors for plantation cropping, right? So there's tons of pesticide dumping, so much so that villages that are not anywhere near these areas, you drive through them, nobody people who used to drink from these rivers, use them regularly, their villages stink all the time. And, they don't have to sort of have a scientific water analysis to know that this is no longer safe. People have to buy water, or they have to go to other areas to sort of do various sort of household tasks. So it's even within downstream countries, there's an enforcement problem.
But on the quality of the river, there have been initiatives in recent years just monitoring that. So one to give from South Asia is the Living Indus project, which pretty much just looks at the health of the river and how can they make sure that its ecological health is maintained for the sustainability of the river and the future of the river. So there are projects on national level that have been looking at the pollution element, the health of the fisheries, the ecology and whatnot. But of course, when you have these NDCs and national adaptation plans come out, they do kind of quote these challenges and make a reference to it so that policy might pick up on it. But it's an important area to concentrate more and more on, especially with the large industrialization that is taking place. But we were also yesterday talking about the problem of, we've been talking about water scarcity, which is too little water, but we also talked about too much water. And, the kind of flooding that speaking for South Asia, it has seen the catastrophic flooding in Pakistan in 2022, repeated floods in Bangladesh. That is something that has been damaging to, across the nation, to states and river banks. So that's another challenge that now requires things like early warning systems and rehabilitation and adaptation on another level. So there's a whole outlook on water, whether you look at the scarcity side or you look at the excess side. So the governments really need to ramp up action in that department as well.
If you go downstairs to the museum, you will see one gallery where there are videos from all over the world of flooding and people in each of these countries, walls all around you, coming to their homes after the floods and discovering what's happened. I think, you describe rivers. I think there are only 2 rivers in Asia of consequence that are fully within one country. That's the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. That's a relatively easy thing because the country can do what it wants, and it's a unified.
Can I just say, because I actually wanted to make a point here. This is an anecdotal point, but I think it actually goes back to both of the questions, pollution, but also, who has the right to arbitrate an upstream versus downstream. We actually also have a lot of upstream, downstream dynamic just within China, right? One anecdote that I can raise here, and this has something to do with energy as well. You may realize that China does not build inland nuclear power plants. All the nuclear power plants are along the Chinese coasts, right? But they are not built inland. You have a lot of those nuclear power plants here in the U.S. that are not on 2 coasts, right? But actually in the middle of the country. We don't have that. Why is that? Because normally you would need to situate a nuclear power plant along a major river or a major tributary. And once you try to do that in one province, the downstream provinces will have a lot of concerns. There was actually a pretty high-profile case where one province in China proposed for such a power plant in the early 2010s. And that was just vetoed, blocked by the downstream provinces. So it's just kind of this same upstream, downstream dynamic playing even within the country. But of course, in this case, there was a higher level arbitrator, right, which is the central government. They just decided, and also that was very close to the Fukushima crisis, just decided to not go with inland nuclear power plant.
I assume also that the water source on the coast is the ocean, whereas if it's along a river, you might pollute a river.
That's right.
So there's a, well, listen, we could go on all day here, and I'm not sure there are any easy solutions, particularly to transnational river challenges, but I want to thank our three panelists for sharing their thoughts with us, and thank all of you for coming.